We're here today, we're talking about fats. Sometimes, as scientists, we use the word lipid. Lipid and fat are sort of interchangeable. And by fats, we really mean, fatty things that we consume in the diet. And the main structural component of the fat we eat is what we call fatty acids. So these fatty acids make up most of the fat we eat. And it turns out there are different types of fatty acids, and these different types are due to different chemical structures. So, really, in the world of fats, we're very interested in the chemical structure of the fatty acid components. And that's how we classify fatty acids, and it's how we classify fats in the diet and in our body. So, one of the key points of classification is between what we call saturated fats and unsaturated fats. So all fats or fatty acids, really we're talking about fatty acids today, have a long chain of carbon atoms all linked to one another. So this is a sequential chain of carbon atoms. And sometimes between those carbon atoms, so they're linked together by chemical bonds, sometimes between them they can have a double bond. Now, a fatty acid that has no double bonds in that chain of carbons, that's called a saturated fatty acid. But a fatty acid that has a double bond, one or more double bonds in that chain of fatty acids, that's an unsaturated fatty acid. So saturated fatty acids, no double bonds; unsaturated fatty acids, one or more double bonds. Now, within the unsaturated fatty acids, we have further classifications that maybe we'll come on to shortly.
Yeah. Let's dive into that one because I think that is the probably the topic at hand today is like what is an unsaturated fatty acid and why is that important for us to consider when we're kind of putting
Yeah,
together our food choices?
yeah, okay. So, so I mentioned unsaturated fatty acids have at least one double bond in their carbon chain. But of course, when I say at least, that could be one double bond, it could be two double bonds, it could be three, it could be even more. So we have to subclassify the unsaturated fatty acids. So at the simplest level, we divide or we classify the unsaturated fatty acids into monounsaturated, mono meaning one. That means they have a single double bond in the hydrocarbon chain. And the other unsaturated fatty acids are polyunsaturated, poly meaning many. So they have two or more double bonds in the chain. So now we have saturated without any double bonds, we have monounsaturated with a single double bond, and we have polyunsaturated with two or more double bonds. And in fact, in our diet, depending on what we eat, and in our body, we have polyunsaturated fatty acids with two, three, four, five, six, maybe even more double bonds in low amounts at least in some foods. So we're eating a variety of fatty acids with these different chemical structures. What I haven't mentioned to date, because I've been focusing on the double bonds, is these carbon chains that I mentioned can also be different lengths. So commonly in the diet, we eat fatty acids that have 10 to 20 or so carbons in the chain. So now you see the complexity of this area. We have fatty acids with different chain lengths, and we have fatty acids without double bonds, we have fatty acids with double bonds, and we have fatty acids with lots of double bonds. So, probably on any day, we may be eating 30, 40, 50 different types of fatty acids, some of them in high amounts, some of them in low amounts. Now, I think this asks a couple of questions. What is the biology or the nutritional value, if you like, of the fatty acids with the different structures? And where do we get them from in different foods? Okay, so these are two separate but related questions. Um, so the saturated fatty acids are commonly found in animal based foods, although they can also be found in plant based foods. So, for example, coconut oil and palm oil contain a lot of saturated fatty acids, but so do animal fats. The unsaturated fatty acids, particularly the polyunsaturated fatty acids, we find a lot of those in plant foods, including in vegetable oils or seed oils, as they're sometimes called, but also in other oils like olive oil. But so different food sources of fat contain a different makeup of the fatty acid constituents. We might go into this in a little bit more detail later on when we consider different types of polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, that's a great breakdown of kind of just how those
Yeah,
different structures
yeah,
work and
yeah.
everything that
I,
kinda
I
goes
haven't
into
got
it.
to the omegas yet, so maybe that could be the next step.
Yeah, let's talk about those. I think that'll be a
Yeah,
a
yeah,
a featured group in the
yeah,
conversation.
yeah, yeah. So okay, so far when thinking about fatty acids, we've considered the chain length, and we've considered the presence and absence of double bonds. And I introduced to you polyunsaturated fatty acids as being fatty acids with two or more double bonds in the chain, maybe as many as six. Now, you may not yet have thought of this, but what this means is we have fatty acids of different chain length and with different numbers of double bonds in the chain. So this is getting pretty complicated now because we've got lots of possible combinations of, an 18 carbon long fatty acid that might have two double bonds or three double bonds or four double bonds in that chain. Of course, if the fatty acid is even longer, the possibility of having more double bonds in the chain is greater. So we have a third type of classification. So we've classified according to presence or absence of double bonds and the number of double bonds. But the third type of classification is what we call the position of the double bonds, and by that I actually mean whereabouts in the chain those double bonds are found. Okay, and this actually turns out to be a commonly used way of classifying fatty acids. Um, Although people maybe are not aware that's what they're doing, because this term omega that listeners might have heard of, so omega 6, omega 3, omega 9, the omega number tells us whereabouts in the carbon chain the first double bond is from a particular end of the chain. So in an omega 3 fatty acid, the first double bond is on carbon number 3 from a particular end of the chain. In an omega 6 fatty acid, that double bond is on carbon number 6. In an omega 9 fatty acid, that double bond is on carbon number 9. So if you have an omega 3 polyunsaturated fatty acid, it will have multiple double bonds, but the first one is always on carbon number 3. So the omega number, if you like, is really a description of a feature of the chemical structure. Now, this feature of the chemistry of the fatty acids turns out to be really important in the biology of the fatty acids and therefore their nutritional value, their effects on our physiology, and their impact on our health.
Awesome. Let's jump into that because I think that's probably
Yeah,
what people are thinking. They're thinking, okay, we have like this
mm,
wide array of different structures, and if I eat fat, I'm likely, like you
yeah,
said before, getting lots of different exposures to that.
mm,
But then the next question, the follow-up question is, what does it actually mean? What are some of
yeah,
maybe the health impacts of,
yeah,
say,
yeah,
consuming an omega-6 versus an omega-3, or
yeah.
how are like cell behavior influence or cell
Yes,
membrane
yeah,
changes and
yeah, yeah.
consequences?
Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, okay. So we have to now start thinking about diet in the context of this complexity of fatty acid classifications. So any food we eat will contain many types of fatty acids, although they will be there in different amounts. So particular foods will be much richer in some types of fatty acid than others. So I think a prime example of this is a lot of seed oils. So things like sunflower seed oil, safflower oil, uh, corn or maize oil. Those oils all contain a lot of the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, linoleic acid. So a person who's consuming a lot of those oils, either as oils or using them in foods or in cooking, and of course there are some foods made from those oils, like many margarines, for example. So a person with a diet rich in those foods will be consuming a lot of linoleic acid. Conversely, a person consuming low amounts of those foods will be consuming less linoleic acid and probably more of another fatty acid. That might be more saturated fatty acids, because often we exchange foods that are rich in saturated fatty acids for foods that are rich in these omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. So I think this would be, for example, butter is an animal fat, contains quite a lot of saturated fat. Margarines, mostly made from seed oils, contain a lot of linoleic acid, the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid. So people can be making either conscious or unconscious dietary choices that have a big impact on their intake of these different types of fatty acids. So why is this important from our physiology and from our health point of view? So fatty acids are not inert when we eat them. They actually do stuff inside our body. They are biologically active, and they work in lots of different ways in the body, essentially controlling how the cells in our body are functioning. So they control our metabolism. A good example is the production of cholesterol. So the liver is the main site in the body where cholesterol is made. And what's really interesting is most of the cholesterol in our blood is actually made in our body in the liver. It's not coming from our diet. So, what we call endogenous synthesis of cholesterol produces more cholesterol than we're actually eating. Now, saturated fatty acids increase the cholesterol production in our liver. Linoleic acid actually helps remove cholesterol from the blood and put it out of the body in bile. So saturated fatty acids and linoleic acid can have opposing actions, the opposite effects on our blood cholesterol levels. So saturated fatty acids can increase blood cholesterol because they help the liver make cholesterol, whereas linoleic acid lowers cholesterol because it helps the liver remove cholesterol from the bloodstream. So that's a good example of how two different types of fatty acids actually have the opposite action. And those two fatty acids are acting to have those effects actually by controlling gene expression in liver cells. So those fatty acids are actually controlling the genes that the liver is using to control cholesterol metabolism. So that's a good example. And that's about controlling gene expression. But the other really important thing that fatty acids do in our body is they get into our cell membranes. Now, the membranes are sort of the envelope around the cells, and membranes are made of fat. They're made of a particular type of fat called phospholipid. And just like dietary fat, the membranes around our cells contain fatty acids in their structure. So, one of the main roles in the body of fatty acids is in cell membrane structure and function. Now, the different types of fatty acids I've mentioned so far: saturated fatty acids, monounsaturated, omega 6 polyunsaturated, omega 3 polyunsaturated. They have different structures, we've already said that, and the structures are related to their functions once they get into the cell membrane. So, in other words, membranes containing a lot of, for example, omega 3 fatty acids behave very differently from membranes containing a lot of omega 6 fatty acids. And what do I mean by membranes behaving differently? So, membranes are the way our cells are communicating with the outside environment. So, for example, cells of the liver, again, have to respond to hormones. Cells of muscle respond to hormones. Cells of the heart respond to electrical signals. Cells of the immune system respond to infectious signals. All of those signals are outside the cell, but the message is received by the cell membrane. And that message is sort of interpreted, and then the cell makes a decision on how it will behave in response to that signal. And what I'm suggesting to you is that connection between outside the cell, where the signal is, and what the cell is doing is controlled by the membrane fatty acid makeup. And membranes richer in certain types of fatty acids are causing cells to respond differently from membranes that are richer in other types of fatty acids. And here there's quite a distinction between the omega 6 and the omega 3 fatty acids. And they often have opposing actions at the cell membrane level. So a cell that's got a lot of omega 6 fatty acids in its membrane will behave very differently from a cell with a lot of omega 3 fatty acids in the membrane. This is really important for inflammatory cells, for immune cells, for brain cells, for heart cells, and maybe actually for all the different cells in the body. It's just we haven't studied every different cell type. So, again, keep in mind that these different fatty acid families are having different actions once they get into the body, and a lot of that is about them getting into the membranes of your cells.